Okay, this set of notes is going to deal with an if-else structure that will contain more than two alternatives. So we're looking at an if structure with multiple alternatives. And so to demonstrate this, first of all, we're going to look at an example. Let's say that you have a chart here on the Richter scale, which is a chart that shows the type of damage that could happen based on the magnitude of an earthquake. And so here in the values are magnitude values 8, 7, 6, 4.5. So at 4.5, starting at 4.5, there could be damage to poorly constructed buildings if an earthquake has a magnitude of 4.5. Starting at 6, many buildings considerably damaged, some even collapse. And then all the way up until 7, and then you have 8. So you have the different effects based on the magnitude of an earthquake. Now there are really, it looks like there's 4 alternatives, but really there are 5 alternatives, because what if a magnitude is less than 4.5? So the important thing here is that you cover 8 and above, and then from 7 to 8, then from 6 to 7, from 4.5 to 6, and then below 4.5. So you want to make sure all those are covered if you're writing a program where the user will enter the magnitude of an earthquake, and then your program would display the possible effect that earthquake will have on the area that it affects. So anyways, there's really 5 alternatives for this particular situation. Now 5 alternatives means an if that has only one alternative is not going to work. And then we've also done a 2 alternative, so where we've done an if. So if this is true, we do this particular clause, and then we ignore the else. Or if this is false here, then we would ignore the if clause and then do what the else clause says. So you have 2 alternatives. And we did this back when we first learned how to start with using the if-else structure, when we had a person enter a score, and the 2 alternatives is either they, based on the score, either the student passed the test or the student failed the test. And so those are 2 alternatives. Now we have actually 5 alternatives dealing with the Richter scale, or the magnitude of an earthquake. And so as we look at this example here, here's an example of using 4 alternatives. So this has 4 alternatives, and you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is a good example to use to look at if you need help on how to set these up. Now to explain this particular situation, what we're going to do is we're going to try to make it so we see question 14, and this will make a little more sense as we go through this. So we have an if-else structure using more than 2 alternatives. Here's what happens. The if statement is at the beginning. So you see here we have the very first statement of an if-else structure is going to be the if statement. There's only one if statement, and the compiler will look at the condition or the test or the Boolean expression and decide if it's true or false. At the end is going to be the else statement. So the else statement is at the end, and so we have the else here. So if everything up here is false, then it defaults to doing whatever this clause says to do. Now in between, though, is what we're learning that's new, and that is as many else ifs or as many else if statements as needed in the middle. So as many else if statements as needed in the middle. In this case, we need 2 else ifs. Alright, so the compiler will look at this condition. If it's false, it'll move on to the else if condition. If that's false, it'll look to the next else if condition. If that's false, then it'll do what it says in the else condition. or in the else clause. Alright, that's basically how it works. If you were to have, let's say, 7 alternatives, well, you'd have one if, you'd have one at the beginning, you'd have one else at the end, and then that's 2 alternatives, and so you would have 5 else ifs in the middle. Okay, that's the general rule. So as we move on here, we'll look at this, and this is the idea that's very important to understand, is only one clause or branch will be executed. So even though we have 4 alternatives, only one of these clauses or branches will be executed. And which clause will be executed? Well, it's the clause or the branch associated with the first condition or the first Boolean expression that is evaluated to be true. So it's going to, that whatever clause is associated with the first condition or Boolean expression that's true, that will be the one that will be done. And it says if all conditions are false, the else clause will be executed. So if all conditions are false, the else clause will be executed. So if we just looked at this again, here's what could happen. This could be false, so this is ignored. And then it goes on to here and go, well, this is false, so this is ignored. Maybe this is true. Then this statement is executed, or statements, and then this is ignored. The rest are just ignored. Maybe the first one, the first condition is true. Well, then all the statements within this if clause or if branch here are executed, and then the rest of the alternatives are all ignored. Okay, so that's generally how it goes. So let's get this. Now it's kind of like this. If you were to imagine a prince, the story of a prince and his true love, and I just don't understand why this keeps doing this to me. But anyways, the story of a prince and his true love. So let's say a prince decides one day to go and try to find a princess that could be his wife, to be his one true love. And so he gets on his horse and he takes off and starts traveling throughout the land looking for his one true love. And so he meets with one princess and decides, no, she's not going to work. Meets another princess, nah, she's not going to work. And keeps going until he finally finds that one princess, that will just make his heart skip a beat, cause his breath to stop for a second. And so he says, you are the one, and so I am going to take you back to my castle. We're going to get married. But as he looks past her, he sees several more princesses that are waiting to meet him. Well, he ignores them and just takes his true love, goes back to the castle. They get married, and they live, of course, happily ever after. Well, that's really what happens here, is that the compiler evaluates each condition. It's like meeting a new princess and seeing if she's the right one, and evaluates it. Is this, and he does it in order. The compiler does it in order from top to bottom, which is very important, until it finds the one whose value is true. So once that the compiler finds its one true love, then it executes, and it is here it says, and then executes its respective clause. Execute its respective clause. So once it finds the one whose value is true, he then executes the respective clause, and all clauses before, all the princesses before and all the princesses after are ignored, because he found his one true love. And so here again, this is the idea that we just demonstrated up here, is that this princess isn't right for me, this princess isn't right for me, oh, but this princess is. And so this one will work, and then the rest are ignored. Alright, so that's how it goes. So let's see what we can do here. Now, you're not finished, by the way, when you're with your program until you test each type of possibility. So you must test each type of possibility to make sure that your program is operating as it should. So that includes the boundary values. So the boundary values must be tested as well. So we will go to the next page and see how that works. So here is the Richter Scale program. And so this is basically how it would work. So let's say that the user enters a Richter scale reading or a magnitude of 6.2. So what happens is the compiler comes to the if statement, because that's what you always start at the if statement. And say the reading we said was 6.2. So the question is 6.2 greater than or equal to 8.0? And so in this condition, this test or this Boolean expression is false. So this clause, the if clause, is ignored. And so then it moves on to the next princess or the next condition, which is in the else if statement. The question again is 6.2 greater than or equal to 7.0? Are you my true love? And this is false. So this if clause, this respective if clause or else if clause, is ignored. And then we move on to the next princess or the next condition or test, and then is 6.2 greater than or equal to 6.0? Well, yeah, here we are. This is true. This is the one true love. The compiler has found it. And so because this is true, the condition is true, it tests to be true, then this line, in this case there's only one statement, there can be more, in this else if clause is printed in the sense. This is prints many buildings are damaged and some collapse. Now, so it's found the one true love. You don't need any more love here. We got one true love, that's it. So this is skipped, ignored, this is skipped, ignored. That's it. And so that's how the compiler moves through an if-else structure and decides the one true love, the one true condition that will produce the results that it needs. So now, when you test your program, we were discussing, well, what you got to test your program. Well, you look at something like this. Richter scale is greater than or equal to 8.0. So you try something above it. So try 8.1 or higher, and then try the boundary 8.0. That's what I mean by the boundary values. And then you would test something that would make it false, would be 7.9. Of course, that goes down to here as well. You could test 7.9 or 7.1 or something like that, and then test the boundary. And then maybe 6.9 or 6.1 or 6 point something like that, and then test the boundary 6.0. So you keep doing that, and then that's basically, you test each one either in your as you trace the code, or as you're in JGrasp, you run the program and test each one of those numbers as input, and then see how if you get the correct input. Right? So that's what we mean then by when we talked about up here, is you're not finished with your program until you test each type of possibility, including the boundary values. You got to test your code to make sure it's right. Okay, we are going to stop here, but we are going to continue this on part 2 video coming right up.